All right, Old Main has sounded, so it's 10 a.m. Welcome to the 8th installment of the Honors College Forum Pandemic. Today, the medievalists take over, which is visually very good, but content-wise, super depressing. And our lecture will be divided into two parts. I will present both the most recent medieval medical findings about the nature of the great pandemic of the 14th century. And then I will spend some time on religious reactions to the plague. And then I'm going to turn over the mic and the control, the PowerPoint, to my colleague, Distinguished Professor of Art History, Lynn Jacobs, who's going to take us on a very interesting debate among art historians about the influence of this massive catastrophe in the mid-14th century on medieval art. So we both have a lot to say, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My presentation will be in two parts. As I mentioned, the first part will be about the plague itself and fairly recent interpretations of it. The second will be on religious reactions to the plague. And so this will be a lecture in two parts, as shown to you by these snippets from Bruegel's famous painting of the Apocalypse. It's actually early modern, but it seems appropriate. So to start with the devastating plague, and we've seen this image already because it is a super impressive one from the 14th century, from the period in which the plague was just about to dissipate in its first major attack, only to come back generationally in Europe in the mid-14th century. But you can see here, and this has some resonance with what you're seeing in New York City, the hasty makeshift burial of medieval Christians. And in fact, the chronicles I assigned for today bear this out. The hasty pits dug, the corpses piled one on the other. In fact, the site is a little optimistic. As you can see, people are still receiving individual burials somewhat in the image. So I'm going to start by talking about the ways in which medievalists have been absolutely wrong about the Black Death of the 14th century. That is the bubonic plague that devastated Western Europe. And I found this discussion not only very recent, but the Medieval Academy of America last Friday did a webinar on the Black Death featuring the #1 medical historian, Monica Green. And she was superb. And so I went back and read her recent work and I learned a lot. And that's the beauty of being an academic. It always continues to engage the mind. So what's wrong with the way we've studied the plague? And I'm going to focus on the number 3. Medievalists love the number 3. And I think some of that has to do with the history of Christianity and its Trinitarian paradigm. This is the standard way of treating the chronology and the geography of the plague. And I'm saying it's Eurocentric and imperial. We start with an imperial plague, often called the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, which also ravaged Europe from the eastern parts of the Byzantine Empire all the way up to early medieval Ireland, where a chronicler made note of it in the 7th century. So this is the first great of these waves in the traditional map of the disease. The second is more famous, of course, and that's the Black Death. And that's a phrase used in English in the 18th century. Medieval people called it pestilence, the great morbidity, the great disease. They had a whole series of names, but they did not call it the Black Death. And I'll explain why it's the Black Death in a little bit. And here I'm using, of course, an image of hell with Satan chomping on the bodies of sinners. Because if you read the readings for today, you know that sin was a major paradigm in Western Europe that explained why plague hit so many bodies in such a devastating and supremely visual way. Now, of course, the third, which is bubonic plague, as discovered in the late 19th century. And I'm calling this imperial because it follows the pattern of the British Empire in the East. And this plague, of course, disrupted East Asia and also India very severely. And it was diagnosed eventually as bubonic, a bacterial infection that Dr. Starks talked about, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, but I feel like she set me up very well for to talk about it. So again, this is the traditional way of looking at the plague. I myself have done this, and I'm going to explain why it's problematic now, but keeping in mind that number 3, Justinian, Black Death, bubonic plague, i.e. the more scientific vision versus the superstitious medieval European vision versus a kind of late Roman imperial vision. So just giving you the map. This is for you, Daniel Swee, if you're out there. I got lots of maps. And I'm going to say many of them are problematic. And I thought Professor Swee was great on the point of maps as cultural constructions. And I think you'll see that here, where a lot of maps of bubonic plague privilege Western Europe. And they isolate the rest of the world as kind of, as you can see here. Let me get my cursor moving. You can see here that this is just an arrow out to these other people over here off the map. So this is a map of the Justinian plague, our first imperial plague. And you can see I mentioned this chronicler actually from the 7th century, writing around 664. That's why that date there, and a second lapse of this plague. So this is a map that's very much focused on the old Roman Empire. Why don't we just come out and say it? It's following that imperial line of argumentation. Now, medievalists invented this map in about 2005. If you go out on the internet, you will see it's all over the place. And it is visually pleasing. And it takes you on a supposed chronology from 1346 all the way up to 1353. And it certainly focuses heavily on Western Europe, where we do have some pretty good records. But I think that Daniel Swee will recognize right away, it's pretty amazing right here that we're down here in modern day Romania and in Eastern Europe, and we have a big swath of no data. But even more telling is this massive geographical emptiness all along here. And this is what medievalists are actually starting to question. This is your ultimate Eurocentric vision of the plague, that the plague is something that kind of mysteriously appeared in the East and infected the West, which is a very long-standing classical bias against Eastern cultures. And I think that's certainly filtered down into the ways historians have looked at the Black Death. It's certainly how I was trained. It was kind of like, oh, there's the East over here, you know, whatever they're doing over there. But, oh my God, it becomes important because it comes into contact with Western Europe. And I think this parallels nicely with Kelly Hammond's lecture on East Asia and pandemic. So again, notice this map. This is taking you, we have our Justinian plague, the first pandemic at the top. Then we have the so-called Black Death or medieval plague sweeping into Europe. Again, everything hits Europe. And now because we have the British Empire, we're starting to only think about the third pandemic as worldwide. And that's what medievalists are contesting now. And in fact, in the session that the Medieval Academy held, we had an Africanist talking about very recent archaeological and biological anthropological work on sub-Saharan Africa, determining that yes, the Sahara wasn't a huge boundary against the plague, as I was taught many years ago, but it actually was porous. And it is more than likely plague has filtered down into Africa in the 14th century in ways that scientists and historians are just now coming to terms with. So again, we have to kind of let go of this European-centric model, especially in the age of COVID-19. As I think all of our presenters have made clear, this is a global issue. We're all in this together. And that appears to be the case in European history in the Middle Ages. So again, just to summarize, and actually give you some new information that has come out since 2011. It shows you that people always ask me, well, what can you say that's new about the Middle Ages? Well, this is the beautiful thing about historiography, or the ways historians study the changes of a historical interpretation over time. And yes, interdisciplinarity, that is the union of the STEM disciplines with history, have totally changed the map of the bubonic plague. So let's look at some of the new evidence, keeping in mind that that three-wave paradigm, I call it the Trinity system, appears to be under heavy assault. The thing that I found very interesting from Monica Green is that their scientists are fairly certain that even the Justinianic plague was not the first plague to hit the western part of Europe or even big pieces of the rest of the world. That is, back to the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, biological anthropologists, paleogeneticists, climatologists, and people that work on ecosystems have now discovered traces of Y. pestis all the way as far back as 5,000 years ago. That means we're not dealing with three major pandemics, largely imperial and Western in their construction, but actually, again, a global system of great antiquity and perhaps as many as 8 waves of pandemic, but certainly 5. This is the part of the story that is still coming into being. So I'm not going to sit here and say, as many of our presenters have, this is the final answer. This is part of the becoming that is so challenging in being a historian. The other thing I learned of great interest to me is that, of course, plague doesn't just go on an old classicizing paradigm of the sort of contagious East, unknown, mysterious, massively infectious, being then hurled at the West, but it actually goes both ways. And you'll see on my map, I've got some little teeth. Of course, part of this is a tribute to Peter Ungar's Honors College Signature Seminar, Teeth, which was fantastic and proved to me the value for history of studying dental patterns. But now, new archaeological and biological anthropological evidence tells us that this plague also traveled backwards in the 14th century. So the West is now the contagion of the East. So it's something to keep in mind as I go through these slides. Now I come to the other great historiographical puzzle. The Yersinia pestis, Y. pestis, that I think that our doctors discussed. Dr. Newton certainly knows more about this than I do. You see it in the top left, that kind of creepy, purpley pink specimen. The question for the medievalists as late as the year 2007 at the University of Glasgow was, how do we know this was really the Y. pestis that was discovered in the late 19th century in imperial British circles? How do we know? Because bubonic plague, as it manifests itself in the late 19th and 20th century in Hong Kong and in India and other parts of East Asia, was a very slower moving. I mean, it certainly was deadly. It killed millions and millions, but it didn't travel along routes quickly. Its contagion factor did not appear to meet that of the 14th century plague. Could it be the case that we were projecting the 19th century plague back onto the 14th century and then rereading our medieval sources accordingly, and in fact, even challenging their accuracy when the chronicler's descriptions did not match what was seen in the 20th century plague? So could it have been influenza, which, as we all know, is massive fast traveling, human to human, airborne, etc.? Could it have been a more common crowd disease like cholera or typhus? And so these questions were out there, and they weren't stupid, by the way, because I think it's not till about 2011 that the influence of biological anthropology has settled a lot of this for us and has determined again that yes, we are dealing with the Yersinia pestis that Trish Starks and others introduced us to last week. That is the bacteria that causes bubonic plague, or what the 18th century called the Black Death. And I'm going to explain how it is the case that anthropologists now believe this, but it has to do with teeth, and it has to do with the fact that dental pulp contains trace evidences of blood. So if you take the developments in biological anthropology and you parallel them with paleogenetics, I love that, we actually have a lot more accurate information about the bacteria than we did in the 20th century, in which the evidence was kind of degraded in terms of its DNA, but also a lot of the graveyards couldn't be accurately pinpointed to the mid-14th century. Scientists and interdisciplinary teams appear to have solved these problems. In my view, that doesn't mean the question isn't still open. I've been through too many of these historical terms and turnarounds to think that we always have stability in this long continuum of human history. So let's settle right now on the why pestis of the bubonic plague. And of course, bubonic plague, well known to us from my favorite film of all time in the top upper right. And this, of course, is the great Swedish film, The Seventh Seal, which is a recasting about the Book of Revelation in 14th century Sweden. And you can see that it features a knight, Max von Sydow, and he's playing a game of chess with death. And he has caught the plague. He's coming back from the Crusades, so he's traveling along that east to west route. And he's bargaining for a little bit of extra time. I won't tell you what happens. But the Black Death in the 18th century probably most likely was bubonic plague. On the left, you can see its blackness, and that's in its septicemic forms. It tends to enter the bloodstream and cause cell necrosis, causing the extremities of hands, fingers, and feet and toes to turn this horrible black color. It's gangrene, basically. And then you see to the right on the bottom, my plague specialist saint, Saint Roch, who is often depicted from the 15th century on as showing you the swelling of the lymphatic system, the bubos, which gives us the word bubonic. And again, not a very interesting Latin word. Bubos just means swelling. And so he's actually showing you the signs of his disease. And for those of you who love the Camino de Santiago, you will also notice he's dressed as a pilgrim on the old medieval pilgrimage trail in Spain to visit the site of St. James, which many people afflicted with the plague did. They went on pilgrimages as therapy. Let's go back and think a little bit more about these what I call plague trinities. Now I've captured the why pestis here. And just again, this gives you a sense of how historical paradigms have a life of their own. Even when they've been routinely challenged, they go on their merry way. They are reduplicated in classrooms everywhere. Textbooks are the worst offenders. It takes decades to move a textbook away from outdated theories of history. And of course, in the popular world, they're totally misconceived. But I'm talking about a trinity of plague here, and I'll explain what I mean. Again, 3 waves of plague. This is the old paradigm: Justinian, Black Death, Imperial Plague. 3 modes of transmission. That is, the 14th century must have had a trinity vector or triangulation of flea, rat, and human, as Professor Starks talked about. This is the classic bubonic plague of the late 19th and 20th century that did appear to operate on a rat flea human vector. And we've already discussed this, but again, flea bites rat, rat dies, flea bites human, et cetera, et cetera. But why is that a problem? I'll get into that. Historians of medicine now do not believe this was the only or predominant vector in the 14th century. I've already mentioned bubonic plague, as we saw in the late 19th and 20th century, is not fast moving, which means this clumsy vector involving rats could not have had the global sweep of that 14th century pandemic, nor could it have had the sweep up to northern Europe, where we have very little archaeological evidence of large rat populations. In colder climes, there must have been different types of vectors of this disease to have made it so contagious, and clearly, as your chronicles point out, human to human infection was at a very high rate. So, and this is where I think Dr. Thomas and Dr. Rothfeld and also Dr. Forbes, their lectures are super informative because they have pointed out, don't just look at the rat, look at the deer, look at the camel, even cute little Hoffenpfeffer, the cute little bunny. There are hundreds of animals that can carry plague. And as this disease moved into different ecological systems and environments, most likely it had a series of carriers, not just the classic one, which is, of course, this one, which I was taught in that historical paradigm that has a happy life of its own. This is the way bubonic plague was taught for the last century. So let's complexify this by saying, well, a deer gets plague and dies and I eat the deer. We've talked about this also in the veterinary discussions and in Dr. Forbes. Same thing with camels. Camels who could, of course, penetrate through the sub-Saharan world, also with carrying contagious meat with them. Or even to the seemingly innocent and cute rabbit, also an object of eating. So there's many ways that humans could have actually gotten plague. And we need to think over and beyond the rat vector. So medieval medical historians now are looking very carefully at the role of, and I hate to say this because people don't like to hear this, they are looking at human lice and human fleas as direct transmitters of bubonic plague. Now, I was taught this too. It makes sense from even the documents I assigned that it's human-to-human contagion, and medieval Christians are certainly very aware of this. You can see that they were worried about contaminated garments. They understood that going into the house of an individual who had the disease was a problem. And so this kind of straight, there are fleas that specialize in human flesh, and there are also lice that specialize in humans. These are also very active and pretty effective transmitter of plague. So changes in environment, ecological systems, and the vectors are much more complicated than that standard Trinitarian view of flea, rat, human. Populations in Europe, by the way, were already malnourished and food insecure in the 14th century. They had just gone through a series of crop failures and famines. So you have to keep in mind that we're talking about pretty weak bodies in the year 1347, in addition to all the things that I've mentioned. Now, we like to have three modes of plague, and it's true, right? Especially as modeled by the 19th and 20th century big pandemics. But now we think we're going to add a fourth. We've got the bubonic, characterized by the bubos, or the swelling. The pneumonic, which of course is that aerosol transmission of infected bacterial into the air, the spray. Septicemic, of course, the entry straight into the bloodstream. Let's think about them all being active in the Middle Ages, and then add the gastrointestinal kind. As you can see in some of those documents, they're talking about diarrhea and throwing up and things. It's clearly something gastric in there, although septicemic can do a lot of the same symptoms. But let's think about people eating tainted things. So they're eating the meat of diseased animals, or actually, the medievalists now think that it was a diseased shipment of grain that moved from the Crimea to especially Italy and struck the plague at multiple ports, because Italy in the Middle Ages is super open. It's like a big airport nowadays. Would have had international trade coming in and out all the time. That the disease may have actually spread through grain. Not that great story that everyone knows, and I had the students read, of up in the Black Sea at a site called Kaffa, the Mongol invaders hurled dead bodies into the city of Kaffa, where Christians were taking up a siege for 3 straight years. Now, we can get into that in the discussion period because I had you read the scene, but it doesn't seem like that would have been a terribly effective mediator, though the Mayo Clinic has actually weighed in on the siege of Kaffa and has said if disease was actually in the bodies and individuals had cuts or abrasions, that they could have actually taken some of the disease into their bodies. But I will leave that into the medical world. I will just say that from a port city on the Don River, and the site is called Tana, we now think that disease grain shipments went to Constantinople and then hit Italy and other places at multiple points. So instead of just thinking about the 3 types of plague too, medical historians think we should, rather more accurate and more appropriate to the 14th century, we should think about 4 ways of categorizing the Black Death through the modes of transmission. Insect bite, I mentioned an abrasion. People that have open wounds are obviously easily can be contaminated with these diseases, as Dr. Forbes has told us. Inhalation, which is what we're dealing with now in COVID-19, but also let's add ingestion, that is eating infected meat. And we certainly have seen that in the history of disease on the planet as late as the late 20th century or even into the 21st. So we're back to the Y pestis. And yes, the Mongols had a role. Now the belief is that this disease broke out on the Tibetan plain and in Western China in the 13th century, though some historians of China think maybe it was even the late 12th century, that it migrated along Mongol military routes, disrupting rodent populations such as marmots in Kurdistan. The disease then took on a series of environmental shifts depending upon the kind of populations, rodent and mammal populations that you were dealing with, and then was transmitted most likely through contaminated shipments. It is, as of now, the Y pestis, as I've already discussed. How do we know that? Let's bring in the teeth guys. Excavations such as this one are still going on in Europe, and now they're extending finally to other parts of the world. That is to Russia, East Asia, and now even into sub-Saharan Africa. The medievalist who gave a great talk on Africa actually teaches at the University of Ghana. This is a 2011 excavation of a large and datable Black Death cemetery in London, and you can see it's on the old Royal Mint site. So this is a site in which lots of bodies have been discovered. We have very good archaeological and even textual evidence that this was one of these mass graves for plague victims in the 14th century, and that we have found teeth even under the London Underground. As they dig new channels for the trains to go through, they pop into some of this material evidence. Skeletons and teeth, as you can see here, preserved from the 14th century and dated, they believe, accurately to the time of the Black Death. I've already mentioned that dental pulp contains sufficient blood for DNA extraction to be done in a fairly straightforward way. So the anthropologists, that is the Peter Ungars who study this, are pretty convinced they're dealing with the Y pestis, but not in those traditional ways that we have talked about, that is our Trinitarian vision of bubonic plague. That's got to go. And as I mentioned, it's not just in England, though that find in England was pretty spectacular. The Spanish are conducting these. They've even found mass graves of Jews who were actually slaughtered in places in Aragon. So there's a lot of work going on right now about marginal groups who suffered, as they are right now, in this great pandemic. There's work, you can see the Russian evidence is just starting with a single grave. And then there's a lot of stuff going on in Germany in this subject. So leaving that science and medical history and biological anthropology behind, let's get on the ground in 14th century Siena and Florence. And I assigned the students documents related to both. Look at that great guild commune world. On your right, you can see the heart of medieval Florence right here. This is where the government actually would withdraw and live for periods at a time. They certainly did that during the period of the Black Death. So this is actually a big dorm for politicians. And you see this big open piazza here, characteristic of the medieval commune, which is a guild commune. Unfortunately, it's a fabulous story. I don't have time for it. But in addition to those wide open piazzas, I'd like to take you up into a feudal tower. This is a medieval tower that aristocrats would have lived in, this kind of thing in the 12th and 13th century, and give you a view that we're really dealing with a lot of snaking, close proximity building, although much of this is later. A lot of the streets are still following those medieval, very organic systems, close and cluttered and dense, which sets up Italian towns really beautifully to be hit by bubonic plague. One of the historians I assigned for reading today is the great chronicler of the plague, who was from Piacenza, and his name is Gabriele de Mussis, and he wrote this history of the plague, or you can see the word he uses, which is morbus. He was a notary, and this is of great interest, so I've zoomed you into what a notary's office would look like in the 14th century, because I can do that. And Gabriele, the notaries were on the front lines, kind of like the undertakers, because they were drawing up last wills and testaments. In fact, the great social and economic historian, David Hurley, he traced the relationship between wills and the plague. There's a huge uptick in people writing wills and testaments in the mid-14th century, and they would have gone to notaries to authorize these. And you'll see the notaries are dying, according to the chroniclers, because it's kind of dangerous work. And of course, he gives us some of our most disturbing images of the plague. I'll just read for you, and this is an image of Siena, and I think Dr. Jacobs is going to come back to this image. The mortality began in Siena in May 1348. It was a cruel and horrible thing. I do not know where to begin to tell of the cruelty in pitiless ways. It seemed to almost everyone that one became stupefied by seeing the pain. Victims died almost at once. People would swell up in their armpits and their groins. That's bubonic plague. Although 1918 Spanish influenza document says there was lymphatic swelling there too. But it seems pretty consistent across medieval sources. These lymphatic swellings called bubos appear all over the place. Father abandoned child, wife, husband, brother, sister. No one could be found to bury the dead. That reminds me of New York City. They had to import morticians from all over the country as emergency undertakers during this pandemic right now that we're grappling with. Great pits were dug in Siena, and that's what the archaeologists are working on. And they were piled deep with the dead. They died by the hundreds, day and night. And then in the most famous sentence of all plague history, I, Agnolio de Tura, called the fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. So you can see whatever this was, it was rapid, it killed quickly. And in fact, as a great medical historian, Lorraine Daston argues, if you took the pandemic of Siena in 1348 and translated it to the United States right now, 100 million people would be dead within a few months. 100 million. Religious reaction. I don't have a lot of time for this, but I have enough. I'm not going to talk about the art, Dr. Jacobs. I'm not qualified. But it is interesting, of course, that corporeality and materiality of the suffering of Jesus of Nazareth was foregrounded in the 14th century in ways that pushed his humanity right in front of the viewer. And this predates the bubonic plague. But religious reactions are very interesting in this story. People did a lot of charitable giving. They still went to Mass, though they conducted Mass very briefly. Priests were increasingly hard to find. Mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, many of them died in cities like Florence because they lived in close proximity in dormitories. But also, you have to keep in mind, with the rise of the Italian city-state and commune, saw the massive influx of wealth into these cities, which caused a lot of anxiety even before the bubonic plague hit. Towns like Arezzo, they were very wealthy, and avarice was considered to be a great sin, that is greed. And here you can see St. Francis expelling demons from one of these Italian city-states with its close, dense, packed-in urban landscape. These are most likely personifications of avarice and urban violence. And a Franciscan could come to your town and go, poof, that's pretty awesome. We could use that here. But this gets translated beautifully into the plague world, where no longer is it just avarice and luxuria and all the great 7 deadly sins hovering over a city. Now they're embodied in plague. And here you see the great plague saint, Sebastian. From the 7th century on, he was considered to be a plague saint because the darts and arrows of plague, you can see, are shot through his body. And this is a metaphor for the way that plague comes into the body. We also saw in the readings I assigned that plague has the ability to make the Bible living here and now. It actualizes scripture. The plagues of Exodus, the sort of apocalyptic visions of Ezekiel and Revelation have now come to nest in medieval Italy in ways that are vivid, as has the suffering of Jesus, acted out by traveling bands of very controversial flagellants, non-priestly groups who took up to the road, marching in pairs and whipping themselves to emulate Jesus's suffering during his passion. In fact, these guys would go out for 33 1/3 days on these traveling, snaking, Dies Irae apocalyptic bands to act out the number of years Jesus lived on the planet, which according to the medieval church was 33 1/3. And we can talk about this in the Q&A more. But just in my last 3 minutes, I'd like to, instead of saying that religion stood in the way of medicine during the 14th century, I'd like to say that religion was a driver of medicine. And in fact, the history of human anatomy has to do with the history of human sanctity. Predating the plague of the 14th century, medieval Christians were interested in exploring human bodies. They did this best by looking into the bodies of the blessed dead or the saints who now resided in heaven. So you can have all these body part reliquaries that Lynn Jacobs knows so well. Many of them have little windows that you could look into and see the anatomy or the decayed arm of a saint. So peering into the saintly body gave medieval Christians an idea that corporality and materiality were actually a positive part of God's creation. Hence, the intense musing on the body of Jesus Christ himself as an anatomical exercise. Professor Jacobs is going to talk about these forked crosses from the 14th century. I don't have to do that, but notice the puncturing of Jesus. We even have manuscripts from this time period that are nothing but the vellum page and all these puncture marks. So you could touch the materiality of the suffering of Jesus. So suffering during the plague in the 14th century is a very different idea, I would say, than it is now. And again, interesting to relate, in the late 13th century, the University of Bologna conducted its first public autopsy. Late 13th century, we don't have to wait for the Renaissance. And it did so as a religious exercise. To look into the human body was to muse upon Genesis 1 and the great plan of creation of the deity. And so anatomy, sanctity, and even provocatively, I will say, architecture, all partake in this interest in holy anatomies. That is a tribute to the medical faculties of places like Bologna in the late 13th century, but it also shows you the ways in which plague, human bodies, materiality, and religion are really going to fuel scientific endeavors for the next few centuries. So I'm right at 10:40, and I'm going to go ahead and give control to my friend and colleague, the amazing historian of art, Lynn Jacobs. Let's see, can you take control, Lynn?
Let's see.
Let me see, I gotta allow you to do it, right? Okay.
Let's see.
Got it.
Let's see if I can find the controls here. Let's see. Again, I'm having trouble seeing them. All right, hold on.
I can advance them for you.
Wait a second, I'm gonna make a shot at this.
Okay.
Once I find them, I should be okay. Just finding them.
It's okay. You need a bigger screen.
Yeah, sorry about this.
All right.
Okay, I may need to have you control it.
I don't mind. I got it.
All right, I'm gonna
Just let
have
me know
you do
when.
a slide changer. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. I really enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Coon. It's been really wonderful to be here. Dean Coon, sorry about that. I'm promising not to show any rats, any lice in my presentation. What I wanted to talk about and pose today as a question is a question about how does the pandemic affect the culture, and in particular art, the visual arts. I wanted to start out by just kind of a whimsical thing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Getty Museum Challenge. That's a challenge that the Getty Museum of Art posed to ask people to recreate famous works of art with items they had in their own home. If I could have the next slide. Next slide. There we go. So we have the Arnolfini wedding there. Somebody had a wonderful chandelier that matched pretty closely the Arnolfini wedding and the Angra Odalesque, very cooperative dog in their house. We can have the next slide. Very imaginative bologna there, matching the Dali persistence of memory and the Mondrian toast there. So these are the kinds of things people are doing in quarantine. I don't know if they exactly count as artworks. A number of the students and the questions they posed before my presentation were asking in terms of how does a pandemic affect art, are wondering how pandemics are affecting contemporary artists. I had an emergency texting session with one of our contemporary art historians that I know. I pretty much don't look too much beyond the 17th century, but his response is it's a little bit too soon to tell how contemporary artists are going to respond to the pandemic, but there are some examples, if you're interested in this and thinking about how artists have responded to the AIDS pandemic. One of the big responses that's a work of art, a more coming out of activists, but also could be seen as a kind of work of folk art, is the AIDS quilt. So that's something one can think about in terms of contemporary artistic response. But I really wanted to think about for today how artists responded to this pandemic of the 14th century, that is the Black Death. And we have a specific case study, the case study of painting in Florence and Siena after the Black Death. And that was taken up in a very famous book by Millard Meese, a book called Painting in Florence and Siena After the Black Death, that was published in 1951, shortly after the end of World War I. And in this book, Millard Meese took up the idea and looked to examine the changes in the art in the painting of Florence and Siena, in terms of the style, in terms of the subject matter, which we art historians talk about in terms of the word iconography, and tried to, and located certain changes in the style and iconography and linked it to the cause of the Black Death and tried to kind of explain how that happened. And so I want to kind of talk through his argument and some of the responses to that. So if I can have the next slide. So to understand Millard Meese's argument, what Millard Meese was arguing was he looked at art for the Black Death. Is that okay? Can everybody hear me? So before the Black Death, in the beginning of the 14th century, or what the Italians call the Trecento, we have the rise of this really major change in art, this tremendous new realism in art with the artist Giotto, which we can see in this crucifix. And in Italian churches, they often hung these big, huge crucifixes. They're almost life-size works of art. They would hang them from the ceiling in front of the altars or behind the altars in the churches. And Giotto brought about this incredible new realism in his depiction of the body of Christ. We can have the next slide. So this is before the Black Death, around 1300. When we look at this body of Christ, we can see that the body is very three-dimensional. You can see that Giotto is using a lot of shading, light and dark, so that the body seems round. His body seems to pop out from the background, and you can see the head of Christ is tilting forward. So it seems to come from forward from the background. And you can see that the anatomy is quite realistic. You can see the musculature and ribs of Christ. And you can also see like his stomach, it's rounded. It appears to have a rounding to it. And if you look at the loincloth, it looks like real cloth. Now, some of this might look a little greenish to you. Part of the problem is that this work was underpainted in a green color, and that has kind of shown through over time. It would have looked a little bit better flesh tone, so don't let that throw you. Now, if this was an extremely new realism for the time, so if I have the next slide, please. That before Giotto, in the period before that, and naturally, of course, we always have to go backwards to understand what's going on. The style before Giotto, the style of the 13th century, was very unrealistic. It's a style that we call Italo-Byzantine style. It's the style of the 13th century, or what the Italians call the Dugento, the 1200s or the 200s, they call it. This style you see in this crucifix by Copo di Marcavaldo is much less realistic. Can we have the next slide? So you can see that Copo di Marcavaldo's style is much less three-dimensional. Instead of having a lot of shading and highlighting, it's much more linear, so it's much more flat. The face of Christ isn't very realistic. It's much more style that the Byzantine world had, so it doesn't look very realistic. The head isn't really tilting forward. And you can see the stomach, well, they're trying to kind of get a six-pack abs, okay, but it's really not having a sense of volume. It's very flat and linear. And look at the way the loincloth is made. It's really in the form of line, and the anatomy is much less realistic. So Giotto, in the beginning of the 14th century, before the Black Plague, there's this great new surge of realism in the art that nobody had seen before. It's a tremendous breakthrough in style, away from the Italo-Byzantine style of the preceding century, the 13th century, the Dugento, to this new style at the beginning of the 14th century. A new style of realism with space and volume, and Christ is looking so human, much more human than he looked before. So can I have the next slide? And this is, again, if we look at another kind of altarpiece that you would see on the altars. These would decorate the altars in a church, and the priest would celebrate Mass in front of it. So when you would go to church, this is what you would see, these kinds of images on the altar. So this is the Ogni Santi Madonna, Madonna and Child with Saints. So here you see Giotto's Madonna and Child. You can see that she's seated on a throne, and the throne appears to recede in space. Now, they have not invented the principles of linear perspective yet, so it's not being done with a mathematical system, but still it's working pretty well. You really feel that there's a spatial recession. When you look at the angels, they really seem to go back in space. If you look at the angels in front of the throne, they really seem to be in front, and the angels have three-dimensionality. The Virgin seems to have bulk, maybe even too much bulk, but she has a sense of volume. If we can get the next slide, we'll get a little bit closer in on some of those figures. You'll see that there's a sense of roundness. Now, people often say that that baby doesn't look so babyish, but for the time, this is quite realistic. And you sense a sense of the bodies under the drapery, a sense of gravity to the figures, that they actually like are standing on the ground. They're not floating, and they have three-dimensionality and volume to that. And if I can have the next slide again, you can see that again. I don't mean to pick on poor Colpo di Marcovaldo, but he is again representing that earlier style, the Italo-Byzantine style of the 13th century, the previous century, where things are much flatter, and we don't have a sense of the body under the drapery. Let's get a little bit closer up. So let's look at the next slide where we're getting a little closer. Now that is a very unbaby-like baby. And you can see how the drapery is just very linear. You do not feel a body under the drapery very much. And you really don't have a receding throne. Everything is very flat. And the figures in the 13th century do not look human, whereas Giotto's figures in the beginning of the 14th century look so human. And that is just a revolutionary change that happens at the beginning of the 14th century. And this, of course, the high point of that, we can see at the next slide. Giotto goes up to Padua in Northern Europe. He decorates an entire chapel with frescoes, the Arena Chapel. And the most famous scene in the Arena Chapel, the lamentation over the dead body of Christ, we see here. Christ, the Virgin Mary, lamenting over the dead body of her son taken down from the cross. This incredible sense of the humanity of Christ. So we have this real sense of this as a human event, a mother, the Virgin Mary as a mother confronting the dead body of her son. So told as a real human story, a human person experienced human emotions, and done in this incredibly realistic style where the figures have real three-dimensionality, where they're arranged in a realistic space. And this is a kind of new kind of realism in art that had not been seen before in the previous century, which had this Italo-Byzantine style. So Giotto was from Florence. We can see the next slide, which gives us, that's just a detail of that. Let's move on to the next slide. Shows us a beautiful scene of Florence, the cathedral. But in the first half of the 14th century, the happy times before we have the Black Death, the bubonic plague coming into Italy, we also see similar developments of realism coming into Siena, a nearby town, not too far away. We can look at the next slide. The town of Siena. There is the square. I think Dean Coon showed that to us. And if we look at the next slide, we'll get a nice view of the town hall, the Palazzo Pubblico, also shown by Dean Coon. Siena was ruled by these noble families who sat on these governing council, which ruled from the Palazzo Pubblico. And if we look at the next slide, we will see this room, the so-called Sale dei Nove. This is the room of the 9. This is the council room where the 9 magistrates who ruled the city of Siena met. And this was decorated with frescoes that have the allegory of the effects of good and bad government, which were decorated by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in 1338. And you're looking at the sides that show on the far wall the allegory of good government, and then the effects of good government on the sort of sidewall. You rarely see, and most of the illustrations don't show you the bad government scenes. Interestingly enough, those are in much worse condition than the good government. And I suspect that people messed with them more because they showed bad things. And so people kind of hit the walls and kind of touched them more. So they're in much less good condition. And in Ambrogio Lorenzetti, in Siena, is also developing this new realism in art. So we can look at the next slide. And this shows the effects of good government in the city. And Dr. Coon also showed us some of this slide of this scene. So this is showing the city of Siena, or kind of ideal image of the city of Siena. And again, you're seeing this great realism. There's a sense of space in the city, and the figures are shown in a very realistic way. We can look at the next slide, which gives us a little bit of a close-up. Everything is going really well in the city. There are people dancing in the streets. Now, actually, at the time, it was illegal in the city of Siena to dance in the streets. It was against the law, but they're showing this in this image because they want to show how good things were. So again, you can't take all these images as sort of literal depictions of exactly the way the city was, but this is trying to show you just how wonderful things are in a city when there's good government. And they're even sticking in something that was technically against the law, but it's to communicate the idea that, you know, everything is so great. And you'll notice also that next to that scene, we actually have a scene of a shoe store and a leather goods store. So even in the 14th century, the Italians have great shoes. And in front of that shoe store, you can see the shoes hanging up there in front of the stall. We have somebody with his donkey. And again, you can see how realistically the donkey has been positioned, receding into space in a very realistic way. That's a technique we call foreshortening. So the artist has really depicted things extremely realistically. And we can look at the next scene. This shows us the other half of that outside the city. We see people going out, and it's the countryside outside Siena. Now, the countryside's really important in Italy because, of course, that's where all the food is grown that's going to need to support that urbanized area. And again, it's a very realistic view out over the countryside, a real sweeping sense of space through the countryside. And you can see people are able to go out into the countryside to enjoy it, but we also see people are kind of doing their agricultural labors, which is extremely important for the food that's needed in the city. And if we get a little bit closer up in my next slide, flying over the countryside is this personification. It may be a little hard for you to see that naked figure at the top, but it is labeled Securitas, security. And there's that she's holding up a guy who's actually hanging on the gallows. So we need security for everything to go well. And she's holding up an inscription in Latin, which means, without fear, every man may travel freely, and each may till and sow, so long as this commune shall maintain this lady justice sovereign, for she has stripped the wicked of all power. So everything is great. We have security, so the people can work in the fields, and they can plow the fields, and the aristocrats who you can see going out of the city, those are the people going out hawking. There's a guy holding a hawk with his falcon. The aristocrats are going out hawking, and there's some people going in with their pigs, so they're going to sell pigs on the market, and people are tilling their fields, and everything is great, and life is going great in the countryside and the city, and the style is very realistic, and things just could not be better. In 1338, the style, the iconography, things are wonderful. Next slide, please. The was the before, and now we have the after. So the Black Death arrives in Florence and Siena in 1348. And up until Dean Coon's presentation, I was thinking that it was from arriving on ships from the Crimea that come to Italy, and the sailors and the rats come off the ship and bring it. So now she was breaking up a little bit when in a presentation, but I think if I heard it correctly, she's saying that we think it's actually coming from grain, contaminated grain that's bringing it to Italy, but I'll check back with her after this presentation to get a little bit more clear on that. But the Black Death does arrive in Florence and Siena in 1348. We think it kills more than half of the inhabitants of the city, although I think, again, this is an area where the death rates are something that people are talking about more and more. We think that Ambrogio Lorenzetti was killed in the Black Death. He was one of the leading artists in Siena at the time, and probably a lot of the other artists in Siena were also killed. The leading artist in Florence, who was Bernardo Daddi, who was working in the style of Giotto, was also killed in the Black Death. He may have been a pupil of Giotto. Giotto himself had died in 1337, so he had died prior to the Black Death. So we have all these losses at this time. So what do we have then after the Black Death? So, and our next slide shows us the change, what has happened, and what Mies points out as this major change in style. So Orcagna, the artist, or Andrea di Cione, his Strozzi altarpiece is often held up as the sort of poster child of the post-Black Death style. And what Mies points out is we suddenly have a very different kind of style. In particular, we have much flatter style and much less realistic style overall. If we get the next slide, we can see a little bit more how things have started to flatten. We don't have a very realistic sense of space. If we look at the Christ here, he is shown, he's actually seated. If you can look, you can see his knees are bent. You can kind of catch his knees under the drapery, though it's a little bit hard to see, but there's no throne shown. So that's kind of weird and not very realistic. And he's handing a book of doctrine to St. Thomas Aquinas on the left and the keys to St. Peter on the right. And if you look at his hands, he seems to be even in space with Thomas Aquinas and Peter in the front there, right in the front of the space. But then if you look at the angels that surround him, there are two angels in the front who appear to be in front of him, like especially the angel on the right, that halo is overlapping him, but the angels seem to be, they're smaller and they seem to be behind, they're kind of being overlapped by Thomas Aquinas. So Christ seems to be both in front of, very in the forefront, but then he's pushed back by those angels. So he seems to be very far in front, but then he seems to be back. So his position in space is kind of ambiguous. He's surrounded by a mandorla, this almond-shaped form that's a kind of big body halo in effect. And it's made up by these blue and red angels. They might look like they're like weirdly swaddled, but they're actually, those are their wings that surround them. The red angels are the seraphim. They're burning with love for him. And the blue angels are the cherubim. Their blue is symbolic of divine knowledge. But the whole space is pretty flattened, and the position in space is very irregular, and we don't have a clear sense of spatial recession. If I can show you the next slide. If you look at the saints in the wings here, St. Michael and St. Catherine, their positioning in space is also a little bit odd. In theory, St. Michael, standing on the dragon there, overlaps St. Catherine, so he's kind of in front, but St. Catherine is somewhat bigger, and usually things should be a little bit smaller as they recede. And also St. Catherine is in lighter colors, which tend to come forward and darker colors recede. So the spatial relations get kind of weird. So can I have the next slide, please? So we have a kind of retreat from realism that seems to go back to earlier forms in the way Mies is seeing it. Mies argues that the flattening of the forms is a revival of Italo-Byzantine forms. And he also thinks that the reappearance of a full-length Christ in majesty, that this isn't something we saw in the first half of the 14th century. That the full-life Christ in majesty is something that we actually see in the previous century in the Italo-Byzantine style, in things like the work I'm showing you on the right, this Christ enthroned. So what Mies argues is that what Orcagna is doing here is he's turning away from Giotto's style of the first half of the century and reviving deliberately the style and also the kinds of subject matters of the previous century, of the Italo-Byzantine style, of the Dugento style, or the 13th century style. And so Mies's argument is that the artists after the Black Death turn away from the style of the first half of the century and deliberately revive the style of the preceding century and the subject matter, the iconography of the preceding century. Can I have the next slide, please? And he sees this, if you look at Giotto, you can see this is a really big change from the preceding century. It really turns away from that realism. And it does seem to be stylistically much closer to the Italo-Byzantine style, much less human. You have this very frontal, much less human looking, scary Christ that's more like the Italo-Byzantine style and more emphasizing Christ's divinity and less his humanity. Can I have the next style? Next slide, yeah. So this is actually Nardo di Cione, Madonna and Child. And Nardo di Cione is Orcagna's brother. Remember, Orcagna is actually his nickname. Andrea di Cione is his name. The Italians are big on nicknames for artists. And this is a Madonna and Child. And Miller and Mies argues this is the same thing that happens in the Madonna and Child imagery after the Black Death. It becomes flatter, it becomes less realistic, and it turns away from Giotto's style more towards Italo-Byzantine style. So we can see the same thing going on post-Black Death, images of the Madonna and Child. We can have the next slide. So here is a Italo-Byzantine image, Madonna and Child by Margaritone d'Arezzo. By the way, Margaritone d'Arezzo, that is actually a man's name. I thought it might be a woman, but it's not. Woman artist, it's not. Again, you see this very frontal, flat Madonna and Child of the Italo-Byzantine style being revived somewhat. It's not quite as simplified, but you can see again that Nardo di Cione is showing a seated Virgin, but you don't see the throne. You don't have so much of a feeling of spatial recession. The saints around the throne seem to more float rather than being kind of grounded in gravity, and the Virgin kind of stares straight ahead, like the Italo-Byzantine example. Can I have my next slide? As opposed to the Giotto again, where you see a spatial recession, where the saints, the angels in this case, not saints, are arranged in spatial depth, and where the Virgin is clearly seated. That is the change that Mies sees. Next slide, please. So then Mies traces these changes, and the question is, what role did the Black Death in causing these changes in the art? Next slide, please. So Mies' argument is that what happens in the Black Death is that we have so much death. This causes a tremendous amount of economic disruption and that this leads to a whole new conditions of patronage for art, new people buying the art and supporting the arts. In particular, what he talks about is that there is, with all the deaths in Florence, there's a lot of need for labor in the city. And there's this need for, there's a lot of immigration of people from the countryside. The Italians call it the cantado. And a lot of people move in from the countryside into the city. And we have this whole new class of nouveau riche, people who have come into money because the wages are very high because there's a shortage of labor. And a lot of the people who were very rich and art patrons before the Black Death have lost their money because there's a whole kind of turnover in terms of the sort of economic structures before the Black Death. It changes completely after the Black Death. So a lot of the people who were rich before the Black Death either die or lose their wealth, and a lot of the sort of people from the countryside move into the city and become rich, and they're the people paying for the art. And Mies argues that these new people were sort of country bumpkins. They were not sophisticated in their artistic tastes. They're coming in from the countryside where they're not exposed to this sophisticated Giotto realistic style. They don't like that stuff. They're unsophisticated. They want this stuff that they're used to seeing in the countryside, this Italo-Byzantine style, and they are wanting this, so the artists are producing this Italo-Byzantine style to suit the taste of these unsophisticated but newly rich people who are buying the art. In addition, Mies argues that there were also people from the newly rich class and also some of the sort of people who are maybe among the middle class and some of the old rich class who still have maintained their money, who see the Black Death as a punishment for sin. And when they look at the Giotto style art and the realism of that art, they see that as a very worldly art, as too rooted in worldly values, too humanistic and not spiritual enough. And so they don't, even if they are more sophisticated than some of the other patrons, they're not, even the more sophisticated people, they're not going to want that art, because they think that is part of that sinful behavior, part of that sinful, more secular, humanistic attitudes that got them in trouble before. And so this is, these are the sort of Mies's explanation of why the art changed and went back, reverted to the Italo-Byzantine style of the previous century, and reverted from the realistic Giotesque style of the first half of the century. Now, this was Mies's argument of the 50s, and this was very influential for many years. And in the 60s and 70s, most people accepted these arguments. It wasn't until the 80s that a lot of critique of Mies came up, and people started to realize that there was a lot of conservative trends in the art that occurred before the Black Death, and that there was plenty of realistic art that occurred post the Black Death. So people argued that one really couldn't say there was a distinct stylistic change caused by the Black Death. So there was a lot of revisionism. Can I have the next slide? Among the revisionists was Henk van As in the late 60s and 70s. Henk van As was in Princeton, had a lot of conversations with Mies. Henk van As is a Dutch art historian. And then in 1981 and 1990, he was working on a reassessment of Millard Mies. And in the end, he wrote, Mies was right. The art of Siena underwent a great change after the Black Death, but I differ from Mies in my interpretation of their nature and significance. He argued that the upheaval, there was a change, but it was due to an upheaval in the production of art, not due to deliberately reviving the Dugento art. He thought artists just weren't thinking that way. They were thinking like, oh, let's go back and revive the Dugento, let's go back and revive Italo-Byzantine. He thought artists didn't think in those categories. It's just we modern art historians who think in those categories. And he also didn't think they were seeking the spiritual. He didn't think that they were that it was because of this new desire for a religious revival or a spiritual revival. He thought Mies was just influenced by the period of the 50s where there was a revival of the spiritual in art after World War II. What Van Os said is no. What happened was there was a loss of the main artists. A lot of them died. There was a loss of big major commissions. There was a loss of cultural cohesion in the time. In the first half of the 14th century, there were in Siena, all these oligarchs running society. They all shared tastes and values. They were all commissioning art. They all had these kind of cultural values that they shared. After the Black Death, those oligarchs stopped running the society. There were these new patrons, and it wasn't that they had these specific tastes to revive the Dugento. It's just that there was no focus. There was this upheaval of production, and so there was just no central focus for how art should go. And that was sort of his reassessment. Some people have asked me my view on who's right here. Rather than kind of get into that, we can discuss that in the sort of Q&A, but I wanted to kind of take this from another angle and look at the view from Northern Europe. And view from Northern Europe is that there were actually no significance of style or iconography due to the Black Death. And it's really only in Italy that this has ever really kind of been sort of identified, any significant changes. I just wanted to look at two kind of examples, to look first at France. And in France, we can see that there really was, if we can look at the next slide, really no significant changes in the style or subject matter before or after the Black Death. This is a Psalter of Blanche of Luxembourg. She married John of Normandy, who ended up becoming John II of France in 1350, right after the Black Death. But she died, Blanche of Luxembourg died right before the Black Death. And this is her Psalter. And the imagery in it shows that there was this taste for the themes, very macabre themes of death before the Black Death. And there was this relatively realistic but elegant style in French art that we see before and after the Black Death. This subject matter of the three living and the three dead is a subject matter, a fable that started, that was already present, that goes back to the 13th century, a story about a duke, a count, and a prince who go out hawking, and that's what we saw people doing in the Ambrogio Lorenzetti, and they encounter three skeletons, and the skeletons have the favorite saying, the skeletons encourage them to repent, and they say to them, what you are, we once were, and what we are, you will become. So it tells these people who are out for just a lovely day, doing what aristocrats love to do, going out hunting and hawking, that they're going to die, and it's a reminder of death. So if we can see the next slide, we see these three aristocrats going out, and these three sort of moments where they recognize that things are not going so great. The first guy with the hawk on the left, he has not quite figured out what's going on. He's just going ahead fine. But the guy in the back is pointing. He sees the skeletons. His horse is already turning and going away. His horse is out of there. And the prince has turned around, and his horse is turning around, and they're definitely out of there. We could see the other slide. There are the skeletons in three stages of decomposition, with the one on the right completely turned into a skeleton. So we have these macabre scenes and a relatively realistic style in French art before the Black Death. And this style, actually, if we see the next slide, was a realistic style that was in France, inspired by Jean Pucelle. from the Hours of Jean d'Evreux, which you can see in the cloisters. Very small book, as you see there in the picture on the left, but a realistic style which is actually inspired by Sienese art, fairly volumetric figures set in a realistic space before the Black Death. And if we look at the next slide, we'll see that, by the way, this is our famous slide from France of scenes of the Black Death, just to tell us we're after the Black Death. Everyone's shown this, and we've all been showing it because there aren't that many images from the time that actually show events from the Black Death. This doesn't seem to have been recorded very often in manuscript illuminations of the time. There wasn't a lot of historical imagery of the actual Black Death. But if we could look to the next slide, this is a manuscript illumination after the Black Death of a banqueting scene from some poetry illuminations. And French art just goes along. If anything, gets a little bit more elegant and fantasy-like. Pretty realistic, but the figures get even more elegant, a little bit more elongated. And the French art is really escapist. Post-Black Death art is totally escapist. Doesn't seem to have any changes, really seem to just totally ignore the Black Death completely. Next slide. And in a way, can I have the next slide, please? In a way, we can see something like this in the art of David Hockney, a contemporary British artist, who's putting up stuff like this on the web from what he's doing during the Black Death and during quarantine, as like little pictures on his iPad paintings from his garden, like this one. Do remember, they can't cancel spring. He's just doing the like daffodils in his garden. That's the impact the Black Death is having on David Hockney. Now in Germany, there's a whole different story. We have the opposite of escapism in German art. You can have the next slide. In German art, in the 14th century, the art becomes really gruesome and expressionistic before the Black Death, and it stays really gruesome and expressionistic after the Black Death. So 14th century art becomes much less realistic than 13th century art. German 13th century art was extremely realistic. We can have the next slide. So here's a 13th century sculpture of Christ on the cross, which is quite realistic. It's a lot of volume, very realistic anatomy. But then in the 14th century, in the very beginning, we have these kinds of crosses coming up in the Rhineland where Christ's body is all distorted and all horrifically gruesome, like the arms become like sticks and the body becomes all bloody and kind of gruesomely distorted to emphasize his suffering to a really gruesome degree. This is before the Black Death. There's the body, the distortions from reality are for the purpose of expression of emotion. That's why we call this expressionism. This is a fork cross, we sometimes call it. And it's the shape of the cross, or a Y cross. It's different than a traditional cross that you see on the right. It's to imitate the tree of knowledge. It's almost like the branches of a tree. The idea that Christ is crucified on the tree that brought sin into the world when Adam and Eve ate from it. So the idea is that Christ redeems from the sin of Adam and Eve, but also relates to a kind of concept of theology in the Middle Ages, of the perpetual suffering of Christ, or the perpetual passion, the idea that Christ is perpetually suffering because of the continuing sinning of mankind. So in Germany, from the beginning of the century, there's a shift away from realism in the sculpture towards this expressionistic art. And if we see the next slide, please. This is after the Black Death, and you might think, oh, she didn't even change the slide, but this is 1380, and it almost looks exactly the same in this fork cross with this extremely exaggerated stick-like arms and this horrifying bloody body of Christ. Can we have the next slide? Almost no change between 1300 and 1380. They keep bringing out these horribly gruesome Christ. Now, these crucifixes are sometimes called plague crucifixes because, and this was shown in Dean Coon's slides, these crucifixes were actually sometimes taken out into the streets and carried through the streets in processions to ward off the plague during periods of the plague. And so they did have a function within the Black Death, but the style or the iconography doesn't really change before or after the Black Death. So I wanted to, on my next slide, just kind of pose some questions. The scholars of Northern Europe kind of question, how do we assess the scholarship on the Italian response to the Black Death, given that it was a pan-European event? Well, it was a pandemic or pan-world event, but we can't see changes of the art in other areas. And my next slide, please. Next slide. Can I have the next slide, please?
Yeah, I'm trying. It's my computer. I'm having a little trouble here. It was going well, wasn't it? Let's see here. Ah! See if I can get it this way. It's my computer. It's not you.
All right.
Sorry. I'll keep trying.
Okay. At any rate, and I was relying on this. I have no idea what I was going to say beyond this. But at any rate, this just raises questions. Oh yeah. So this raises questions about, how we can, theorize about how, a culture is responding to an external event, and how much of a culture's response to an external shock is linked to internal elements within a culture that predispose the culture to respond in that way. Really, are we really, do these external events really, make as big a difference as we think? And so just as a postscript, just to kind of wrap things up, in Florence in the early 15th century, Masaccio kind of goes back to reprise what Giotto does and kind of pick up from there and then push it forward, almost as if, the Black Death was just this kind of interlude that he just moves past. So just moving to my last point, and sorry if I went a little bit too long. Does our case study actually reveal that the impact of a pandemic on art and culture is actually very limited, even in Siena and Florence, and is really the pressure of a culture not to change? And the cultures really resist change in the face of a pandemic.